Welcome to Battleground, your daily source of news and information about what's driving voters in the 7 swing states that will decide the 2024 election. First up tonight, how 2020 election deniers in Georgia seized control of the state's election board. The explosive story that could impact the race in one of our most important swing states. Then, why the growing number of Latino voters in one Pennsylvania town could be good news for Donald Trump. We'll take a closer look at what's going on in Reading, PA. Plus, a look at where this race stands in our swing states as we close in on next week's must-see debate right here in Philadelphia. A Friday visit with Cillizza. I'm S.E. Cupp, and with 59 days until the election, this is Battleground. Kamala Harris in Pittsburgh yesterday, her second visit to Western Pennsylvania in just the last week. Donald Trump also remains heavily focused on Pennsylvania following his town hall in Harrisburg on Wednesday. Of course, all eyes will be on Philadelphia Tuesday night as the two candidates square off in what can only be described as one of the most anticipated debates in modern American political history. And with less than 2 months until Election Day, it may come as a surprise to some that the falsely contested results of the 2020 election are still reverberating in many of our swing states. Just yesterday, we learned there's a new app that provides election deniers a platform to track and share voting conspiracies. Oh, great. In Georgia, 2020 election deniers have now seized control of the state's election board. It's a shocking story that could very well have implications for the results in the Peach State. Nick Corasanidi from the New York Times has penned the must-read story on this issue titled How a Far-Right Takeover of Georgia's Election Board Could Swing the Election. Nick, good to have you here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I know some people out there are saying, I still can't believe we are talking about the 2020 election again, but here we are, and for very good reason. Tell us what's going on in Georgia. They didn't seize the board, like it wasn't a coup, but how'd they take it over?
So to understand what's happening in the Georgia State Election Board, we have to go back to earlier this year. It's a 5-member unelected board, and it had kind of been deadlocked. There were 2 kind of right-wing activist members, 1 Democrat, 1 more moderate Republican, and then the nonpartisan chairman. And so whenever these policies or rules that would come across the board that were more aligned with, say, the right-wing activists in the election space, they would get knocked down. So the Republican member, Ed Lindsay, started seeing a pressure campaign to remove him, coming from all over the state Republican Party, local party chairs, Trump-aligned think tanks from Texas and across the country, really, to get this guy to resign. So in late May, he did, and then the Speaker of the Georgia House appointed his replacement, this woman named Janelle King, and that formed a 3-2 majority that is much more aligned with the right-wing activists in the election space than it had been previously.
And as you point out, Nick, that Georgia election board, it's unelected, yet they now have a major say in how elections are run there, right?
Exactly. And for years, the Georgia State Election Board has played an important but very bureaucratic and kind of uninteresting to the public role in the, machinations of Georgia elections. The board was kind of reconstituted in 2021 with the sweeping law in Georgia that, overrode a lot of the state's election laws. And it removed the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, as chair, made him a non-voting member, and it put the legislature, which clearly has a partisan bent, that's how state legislatures work, in charge of basically deciding the tilt of the board. And that's what, in a way, led us to today.
So what measures has this board put into place, and how have Democrats in Georgia reacted to those measures?
The rule that they've passed that's caused the biggest concern and kind of backlash deals with the certification of elections and local election officials' role in the certification of elections. Now, for years, certification has been an unquestioned ministerial process where, a local election official acts kind of like a scorekeeper, and they add up the points that, would be in a game, in this case, the ballots. They come to a final score and they sign off on it, and on it goes. Critically, they're not the referees. They're not the ones who are supposed to be going and looking at challenges or hunting for evidence of fraud. That's, Secretary of State, law enforcement, Attorney General, courts, lawsuits, things like that. So what the state election board did was they said, actually, local election officials can conduct a, quote, reasonable inquiry into whatever they want before they certify, which has unnerved a lot of Democrats because they think that that then allows them to take their own discretion over whether they certify the results at all. The rule doesn't say that, but a lot of Democrats feel it's implied. So the Harris campaign and the DNC, along with a bunch of other voters and activists in the state, sued to say this will create chaos. It's way too close to the election to do this, and it also is pretty clearly probably illegal because Georgia law very clearly states you must certify the election by a deadline. There's no wiggle room.
So if Donald Trump were to lose Georgia again this year, what would this newly appointed election board have at their disposal to question or perhaps even delay or overturn the certification?
So one thing that's important to note is that the state election board actually itself doesn't play a role in certification. What they do is they create rules and laws and interpretations of rules, and then local election officials follow those. What they also do, though, is they do hear petitions, issues, things like that, and that could come before the board in a post-election challenge. At the same time, they're in a very powerful position. So if they start, parroting concerns, false allegations, if we were to think back to 2020, where there was, the State Farm video, which was so clearly debunked by the Secretary of State's office, if we were to have a state election board that, was willing to go along with that, that adds another veneer of legitimacy to some of these false claims that were so prevalent in 20 and could be prevalent again.
Nick Corsiniti from the New York Times. Nick, thanks for sharing your reporting with us.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, why changing demographics in a key area of Pennsylvania could be good news for Donald Trump. Battleground, we'll be right back. Welcome back to Battleground. Reading, Pennsylvania. It's the hometown of Taylor Swift, but it's also why Donald Trump may not have such a cruel summer in Pennsylvania. The changing demographics there, in fact, may end some of the bad blood between Trump and Latino voters. But when it comes to the blank space on ballots in November, will they write in his name? Okay, see what I did there? Apologies. I'm sorry to all the young people and the Swifties. Let's bring in Asim Shukla, who wrote a new piece for the Philadelphia Inquirer titled Growing Support for Donald Trump in Majority Latino Cities Like Reading Could Help Him Win PA. Asim, good to have you back.
Thank you very much.
Do you forgive me for that?
I forgive you this time.
I had to. So what can you tell us about the shifting demographics in Reading, Pennsylvania?
So Reading is a city that has become much more Hispanic over time in the last 20, 30 years. And that is, the history of that is there used to be lots of good factory jobs, farming jobs, and that sort of thing in that area. That's not as much the case anymore, but what Reading still has is cheap housing stock compared to New York City, Philly, some of the places where these people might have settled in first.
Right. And
so Reading and other cities in Southeast PA, Allentown, Lancaster have this profile now.
Okay.
These, Hispanic voters in these kinds of cities, historically very democratic, excuse me, but that's been changing a little bit.
Yeah, talk about that. You've found in this reporting that the Latino population is moving more to the right.
Yes.
Why is that?
I don't know that there's any one reason, but we've been talking to scholars of educational realignment and that kind of thing and political realignment. And one thing that emerges is that, first of all, these voters are very pragmatic on economic issues and that kind of thing. They're not super identitarian necessarily, and they skew a little bit socially conservative some of the time. And so in a Democratic Party that is maybe a little bit more focused around the interests, frankly, of educated, liberal, urban people,
right.
That is a message that maybe doesn't reach working class Latino voters as directly as it might, as Democrats might hope. Let me put it that way.
And you're finding that there's not only a shift to the right, but specifically among some of these voters to Donald Trump.
Yes.
Why is that?
Again, hard to know exactly, but there's some polling to suggest that young Latino men in particular are drawn to sort of his bravado. And they see Trump as sort of a crusading, perhaps more masculine figure, and that the Democratic Party just doesn't have that sense of representation they might want.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's really interesting. I'm sure the Kamala Harris camp is well aware of this trend because Pennsylvania, all of it is so important. What can they try to do to bring some of these voters back to their side?
I think there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. I think that from what we've heard in our reporting and what my colleagues have heard is that the Democratic campaigns haven't tried that hard with Latino voters, particularly in a state like Pennsylvania. A, because there's not that many of them relative to the rest of the state, but also I think there's some amount of taking them for granted. And I think that what we've heard is that the campaign is taking more seriously, Spanish language campaigning, outreach specifically to Latino voters, which was lacking in the past.
And finally, the debate here on Tuesday in Philadelphia. What's your sense of what voters in Pennsylvania will be looking for from both candidates?
I think there's both sort of style and substance stuff that people are going to look for. I think on the substance, issues, economy remains top of mind. Abortion is important to a lot of people, and I think just what is the way forward. And I think that sort of is a good transition to the style side. I think people still don't really know what to expect from Kamala Harris in terms of what she stands for, what her character is. She's been a little bit out of the limelight during the Biden presidency. So I think perhaps more so than usual, people want to hear from her. And I think on Donald Trump's side, people have opinions of Donald Trump, but how is he going to stack up to her? Is he going to show his age, perhaps? And he's been moving in one direction or another on issues like abortion that he perceives to be a weakness. So what is he going to have to say about that? So
I think it's also worth pointing out, this will be the first time these two have met in person. This debate, that's wild to think about. So I think people are tuning in just to see how that goes, too. Asim Shukla with the Philadelphia Inquirer. Asim, thanks so much for sharing this great reporting with us again.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk to you again, I'm sure, pretty soon. For more on all of this, visit us at battlegroundnews.com or click on the QR code right there. You can sign up for our newsletter, download our interactive swing state map, and find our social media links. And if you miss an episode, that's okay. You can catch up on YouTube or through our podcast. Up next, with Tuesday's must-see debate just a few days away, a look at what the swing state voters will be looking for from both candidates. Battleground will be right back.
Having a swing state is important. It shows the diversity of our state, not just in terms of people, but in terms of ideas.
I know a lot of the rural parts of the state are more Republican.
Do you think Kamala Harris can win a state like Pennsylvania?
No doubt. She can do it in any state, I think, if people were looking realistically. I can't believe there's even this much of a close competition.
Welcome back to Battleground. Pennsylvania's there, weighing in on the election. Well, it's Friday, which means it's time for a visit from our friend Chris Cillizza, author of the So What Substack. And if you don't subscribe to the Battleground News newsletter, you should, because Chris had some terrific intel in there for us yesterday. Welcome back, Chris.
Hello.
Huh. Okay, let's start with what you wrote about in the newsletter yesterday, which was the state of the race here in Pennsylvania. What are you seeing here now?
I just think, and I'm not playing to the crowd. I know this is Battleground states, but I just do think Pennsylvania is it. I talked to a couple election modelers, folks we know at Decision Desk HQ, Nate Silver, formerly of the New York Times, got his own site now. And I said, what are the percentages? I said, can you calculate the percentages to me of each candidate's chances of winning 270 electoral votes if they win Pennsylvania?
Yeah.
And Nate says it's above 90. It's 93% for Trump and 91% for Harris. The Decision Desk HQ people are a little bit more, but it's still in the 80s for both of them. So I just think when we're looking at these states, I said not all battleground states are created equally. You're lucky if you're a battleground state because 43 states aren't, but not all of them are created equally. And I think Pennsylvania, in terms of the state, if you tell me, Essie, if you told me today Trump wins Pennsylvania, I would say, well, Trump's going to win the election. And same goes for Harris. Like, I just think how Pennsylvania goes is how the election's going to go.
Okay, and then another of your top swing states, Georgia, we, of course, had another tragic school shooting this week. Could that move the needle there?
So, I'm from Connecticut. So when the Newtown school shooting happened, right around Christmas, I thought to myself, having covered politics for a long time and really not seen gun control be an issue that was influential with persuadable voters, I thought, if ever, there's going to be a moment, it's the murder of these little kids right around Christmas, families are together. and it didn't, if you remember.
We all thought that, yeah.
Legislatively, it went nowhere. So I am, as much as it pains me to say this, I am very skeptical that a school shooting or even several school shootings or mass shootings are going to change anything. I just think, I think people will say, yes, we need less of them, and that's about the agreement that we can get.
Right.
And the causes and what we do is where we sort of diverge and you just go to your partisan camp. And so I don't think it changes all that much. And honestly, I just as a human, I wish it did, but I don't think it will.
I think you're right. Okay, moving out west, Chris, new polling this week suggests Donald Trump is up in Arizona, but Nevada is still a virtual tie. What's your sense of the race in both of those states?
Yeah, I mean, look, we talked about this before. Let me do Arizona first. I mean, Arizona does not have a Democratic tradition in recent presidential elections. Biden won there by 11,000 votes or so. In 2020, I know, but the state hadn't been won. I think Bill Clinton in '96 was probably the last Democrat to win it. So, you know, this is a Republican state. You got to remind people of that fact. This is not a Democrat. I know it has a Democratic governor now, but it's not a Democratic state. So it does not surprise me that Arizona is maybe reverting back a little bit to what we saw pre-2020. Look, I think Nevada is, for my money, the most both interesting and hard to predict state in terms of how it'll go out. I think it's really hard to poll Nevada because there's so much turnover in the population, right? So what Nevada looked like in 2016 or even 2020 may not be what it looks like in 2024. And so much of polling is based on what's happened before. Then you add on top of that the fact that the economic recovery post-COVID that has, generally speaking, spread out across the country has not in Nevada because it is so dependent on tourism and hospitality, the hospitality industry, which have not fully recovered. So, like, to me, that's the one that, like, if you asked me to push each state, of these 7, I probably could. Not that I'd be right, but I feel okay doing it. With Nevada, you know, I just am really skeptical that anyone, myself very much included, know what's going on there.
Yeah. No, it's a good point. And we've been hearing from swing state voters that they want to know more about Kamala Harris's economic vision. And this week she announced a lower tax rate on capital gains for wealthier Americans than what President Biden has proposed for next year. This applies to any profit that people make from investments such as stocks or bonds. Who is this meant to appeal to politically? And do you think it will work?
Swing state voters who are worried that she is too liberal.
Yeah.
I mean, like, literally that.
Yeah.
This is meant to say, hey, look, you know, I'm not this San Francisco scary communist, Marxist, you know, whatever Donald Trump calls her.
Right.
I'm not those things. Like, I will govern pragmatically. If you look at her speech at the Democratic Convention, it was very much in that vein to say, like, look, I'm not some scary crazy. I'm not Bernie Sanders, right? I'm not going to fundamentally transform the social fabric through the use of government. I'm going to do things like, honestly, I say, like, you know, I don't know that a lot of people were, like, directly monitoring, like, okay, if she lowers the capital gains tax from 36% to 29%, like, it's a thing that makes a difference in some people's lives, but it's much more important, the symbolism of it, right? It's why she's doing it. She's trying to send a message to moderates, to centrists, to swing voters that she is not some scary leftist.
Yeah.
And I think this is one of a bunch of ways she's going to try and do it between now and the election.
Yeah, it'll be really interesting to see if that pulls any voters over the line. Okay, stay right there. I want to ask you about the debate right here in Philadelphia next week. Battleground will be right back. Welcome back to Battleground, here again with Chris Cillizza. So, Chris, we talked to a pollster last week who told us that many undecided voters are waiting for this upcoming debate to make up their minds. So how big is this debate here in Philadelphia on Tuesday night for voters in our swing states?
So I think it's really important for Kamala Harris. And let me see why I don't think it's super important for Donald Trump. Because we know what we're going to get. But I mean, like, Donald Trump has one setting. It's not like Donald Trump is going to be, like, you know, passive and super intellectual and thoughtful. He's going to be Donald Trump, and voters know who that is. It's been basically a decade, right? If you didn't know who Donald Trump was in 2016, you do now. That's why I think he has a pretty high floor and low ceiling vote-wise in these swing states. People, it's just kind of locked in. I think people have decided in large, I don't really like Donald Trump, but his policies, right? And so I think they like many of his policies, including on immigration and the economy, which every voter says in swing states say are the most important issues to them. So the question is, can Harris be a safe receptacle for those voters who do not want to vote for Trump and do not like Trump personally, but are worried about the policies? And so I think she has a lot riding on this. I think he's going to give us a performance exactly like he has given us for the last 9 years, which we've all seen. And even a swing voter doesn't pay that much attention, has seen before.
Yeah. Chris Cillizza, author of the So What Substack. We'll see you next Friday. Thanks.
See you, Essie.
That's it for now. I'm Essie Cupp. See you next time here on Battleground.